Reverend Frank Ritchie is in the building, and we're going to get into a little bit of politics right now. Something's gone on in the news recently. David Seymour has claimed that Jesus would vote for ACT.
Yeah.
And we thought we should talk about the phrase Jesus would.
I don't know if he officially claimed it to be I think he mentioned it in a loose sort of ish way.
It's worth because I commented for a story that was about this. Like if you go to the Herald, you can find the story. And it's worth watching what David said in context. He made quite a light remark about if Jesus came back, etc. But then a reporter asked him a question: would Jesus vote for ACT? He laughed, and then he brushed it off with some light comment about how Jesus would, which you'd expect from a politician, and then everything moved on. So it was not a big deal.
Yeah.
Now, of course, I have thoughts about how Jesus would respond to politics, but it's worth putting that comment in its context so we don't just get angry about something that was a very light-hearted conversation.
Yeah, it was on the front page of the Herald the next day, talking about clickbait. But what do you think about that sort of stuff, right? Because I know we're not in election mode at the moment, but when you are, politics is always a hot topic people talk about, and then when it relates to people's faith, how does their faith cause them to vote? And sometimes people can start to sort of maybe try and push people to a certain way of voting, being like, well, Jesus would probably be more like this, or, and then it can go to much further extremes than that. But what do you think around the connection between your faith, Jesus, voting, your political affiliations, and how do they all interact?
Yeah, I think we need to be really careful with the phrase Jesus would when it comes to politics. And even the idea that Jesus might be completely on our side when it comes to politics, I think we've got to be really careful with that, very, very careful with that thinking. I think as our culture has become more and more secular, and institutionalized religion has faded more into the background, I think people have been replacing it with politics. And so politics has been taking on more of a good versus evil mode in how we think about it, and therefore how we think about our side and how we think about the other side. Our side is good, the other side is evil, the other side is the worst thing that could possibly happen to humanity. And then we go at it like that, rather than putting politics in its place as a pragmatic thing that's about making decisions on how a country or a community are run. And those decisions and those policies are important, but they're not the be-all and end-all. And I think when we look at Jesus, it's very easy to try and transpose maybe some of Jesus' phrases or some of his focus over into a functioning democracy when it just does not translate over. And it's very clear, I think, that Jesus transcended the way that we often approach politics. Like if you think about his context was extremely different from ours. The religious system and the political system were entirely mixed. Those things went together. The temple wasn't just a place of worship, it was also a place of politics, because the people who ran the temple were also part of the whole political system. The relationship between the Roman governor, Pilate, and the high priest, there's a political relationship there, so it doesn't transcend. But if Jesus was going to buy into politics like we buy into politics, he would have had some big things to say about Pilate and the Romans. The reading from the Revised Common Lectionary, Bible reading from the Gospels for the Sunday just been that many churches, not all churches, would have engaged in, talked about Pilate mixing the blood of people with their sacrifices. So Pilate was a man who, when he took up his governorship, went and killed a whole bunch of people worshipping in a synagogue. And Jesus comes to, when he gets the opportunity to interact with Pilate, this bloodthirsty Roman governor who's all about power and his own position. That's what's going on when Jesus is before him on trial. Pilate's really only thinking about his own position and his own power. Jesus never addresses any of that. And the whole Roman system never really addresses it. And then when Paul starts to write about Jesus, he talks about Jesus in a way that puts him in the place of the emperor. He takes language that's associated with the emperor and he gives that to Jesus. Again, no direct addressing of politics. There's this transcendence that goes on. So that doesn't say exactly how we should engage in politics and how we should talk about Jesus when it comes to politics, but it says that Jesus is thinking in a whole other and acting in a whole other way. And so we need to be really careful about not getting caught in politics in the way that everybody else might.
Yeah, a bit of a dangerous one, right? Because, I mean, I can literally think of and name people that I know of or have met or are aware of, Christians who are in the National Party, Christians who are in the Labour Party, Christians who have run for the Greens, Christians who are in New Zealand First. I'm sure there's many others probably represented. So there's people find a way to affiliate themselves with a view or a way of voting that they really strongly believe, that they also, I imagine, is justified by the scriptures and their understanding of them and all of that leads them to that place. But they're so diverse. It's like, well, how do all these people end up in so many different places? Like, you get people that become quite maybe more of a right-wing conservative approach and think that that's definitely, that's where God's called them. But then there's others that would be like, no, Jesus said to share all our possessions and look after the poor.
And
That's
I think
a socialist approach, and then we should, so it's
and I think if you examine most of those people, if we put aside for a moment where the Christian voice is used to denigrate people, and again, play into what we talked about before, fear and anger and that sense of loss of control, sometimes the Christian faith is then used to justify actions that are unholy and bad, I would say genuinely bad. But I think if you look at the New Zealand system across the spectrum, I would say that most people who are genuinely getting into politics to serve, if we're talking about Christians across the spectrum, are probably after the same stuff. They're probably aiming for the same things. They just think about how to get there in very different ways. And so I think, again, you've got to be really careful. If you start really buying into the to and fro of politics, you've got to be careful not to dive into the good versus evil way of approaching it.
Interesting thoughts. It's a tough one to do in reality, but
Yes,
a good thing
very tough.
to reflect on.